we have Jackson with us. Say hi, Jackson.
Hello, it me.
And here's our opening little logo here. Welcome to Evolution Hour 193, part of the Troubles in Paradise project, which dates from a time when there really were typewriters and analog clocks before the modern world. TortuganWordPress.com is the website. There's a whole bunch of freebie stuff there. All the PDFs are open access, share away, have everybody have fun with it. It's not as much material as Jackson and I have compiled in our various books, and we'll be continuing to do so in subsequent books, but it's still a hell of a lot. And just a little bit of older material in there, stuff that I would be revising in an updated text, but it's just like in footnote territory. I'm quite pleased with the overall trajectory of it. Anyway, Jackson is here, probably with the camera off in order to avoid the weird connections that they get in Louisiana. So
You are correct.
Yeah. We're continuing the exciting world of replacing Darwin, going through the source analysis because clever Jensen neglected to offer either an index or a bibliography. So it's impossible in principle to know right off the bat what is he citing and what isn't, and what data goes with what. The only way you can find it out is source by source in the reference footnotes, which is what we've been going into. And we got the live stream going. Hi, Lisa for Truth. Hi, Scott. Let me get out of the way just in case we have troubles. There was Restream was having about almost an hour worth of trying to get a connection up before, and so we'll assume, cross fingers, we can do the entire show. And anyway, let me thank all the patrons of the project. Just in case connection fails, we got our colleagues Hendril, Colton, Eric Rowley, Suris, and Zeshi. Our researchers, Travis, Ian Chan, Comertney, Stephen Early, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound, Studio, DM Wing, assistant researchers, Command Cyborg, Yoranku, Jelly, Todas Real, and Christopher Johnson, friends Steve Bauman, Marigale Beddoes, Daniel, Insects Are Cool, Morton Nielsen, Paul Skeptic, Puffaluffagus, Bo, Rasmussen, Devin Reeves, Alex Stone, Paul Williams, and our legacy patrons, who I will continue to thank. Jen, Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Yui, Mona, Ad, Daniel, Nanya, Staggle, Sun, Sky, Stone, Ugly, German, Truth, Everett, and Sewer. Every one of you has helped make the project clunk along from one step to another in a way that it couldn't have done without all of your help. So, James Downer, I thought that was illegal. Ooh, I'm not sure what you were referring to as what was illegal, but I'm sure many of the things we do, including rigorous thinking, is de facto illegal in so many places around the planet that we should all regard it as intensely precious that we're able to do this sort of thing. There are police state types like the ultimate in oppressive nanny states, the PRC, China, mainland China, PRC, that is endeavoring to control freak everything and make anybody speaking out subject to arrest and oppression and all the rest. And you find other nations that do the same sort of thing. Some nations have ones that have that urge, but are so clumsy or backward or doofus at it that they can't pull it off with quite the relentless proficiency of the techno-laden PRC. Anyway, so, not citing sources. Yeah. Anybody can do anything they want in terms of like what a book comes out. Typically, if you have a thing going through a regular publisher, they're going to want to know that sort of thing. But in the religious apologetic, which is where Jensen is coming from, the idea that you include that sort of stuff is not at all that common. It's not infrequent to find a religious apologetic book, one not aimed at science, just the religious apologetics, that never bothers with an index, that may or may not ever bother listing any sources that they discuss along the way. So this practice, Jensen in here, even though it's got a mass of footnotes, is behaving much more in the theological frame of making a funky argument. Funky. I said that's a terminology there. Now, to be fair, if you look at, say, Bill Nye's book, where he's talking about creationism and other stuff, he didn't have an index. I think he had an index, but he didn't have a reference bibliography either.
Yeah,
so
no.
You would have to. Yeah, and so the whole essence of source methods is bad dog. That everybody, including in videos, should try to document as much as they can. It's one on a screen you can put up the visual image, and that helps. And I've often, been pausing and marking down information, even without a link in the description. But if you have a link in the description, if it's an open access link, especially to where you can find full text available, which is what I do in my show. I don't necessarily list linkages to everything we might be discussing unless they're open access so everybody gets to see and everybody can download it and look at it at their leisure and check to see whether or not I'm characterizing it correctly or not, or what kind of information there is there. Otherwise, if you're just looking at an abstract, you can't really tell a great deal about it. Now, there are cases where I've been having access to the full text of the document, but it's not open access. I've obtained it from some other venue. I'm not going to put the link up for that typically, although I think a week or so ago I put a reference up to a particular source that I wanted it available so people could at least realize it, just in case they wanted to track it down further themselves, because it was relevant to the particular point. So there's the little scholarly minutia. So every single thing I'm doing, whether it's writing books with Jackson Wheat or without Jackson Wheat, either way, and
me?
also there is a book farther down the road, which I'm now going to be calling the Kulterkamp book, which is going to be a history of how anti-evolutionists have tried to inveigle themselves into dominance, and particularly in the educational system. So this would relate to the young Earth creationists in their frame, the stuff that you can see at tip 1.6 and 1.7 already on the website, which brings that up to Dover. But there will be a lot more than just that. And it'll be a detailed discussion of all the various legal efforts in the various states up to when the publication of the book occurs, and a discussion of that Kulturkampf aspect as it directly relates to the anti-evolution movement. And I realized when I was sorting in the great sorting that there was enough information that, gee whiz, that's actually a coherent book topic. And it's not one particularly that Jackson and I have talked about as doing a collaborative effort on. So for the moment, it's just one that I have pegged farther down the road with our collaborative efforts. Needless to say, that's going to involve a lot of time because we have a lot of little things on our plate.
Yes.
And and it's all material that hasn't been dealt with in the way we're dealing with it prior. So it's a fresh contribution in the same way that we would contend the rocks were there is also a legitimate breakthrough in the field in pulling material together and connecting stuff up in ways that hadn't been done before as a comprehensive land base to answers in Genesis and a whole bunch of else. Anyway, back to Nathaniel Jensen. As you know, he's been in his chapter 7 mitochondria dropping for a while. Now he's gear shifted a bit, and he made the disastrous mistake of directly mentioning a 2011 paper by Locke, which I found an open access for, so I'll be putting that in the field, about the orangutan genomes, because they were looking at the whole range of the orangutans. And they came up with a model in which the great ape divergence is about 20 million years ago, and the actual orangutan species are diverging since about 800,000, and I believe other work since then has pegged it down to a couple 100,000 years ago for the orangutans. So they're actually relatively contemporary as a speciation event to us. Jensen acknowledges the date, discusses nothing whatsoever about the material, just puts it in his little footnote. And then the other one that he got with was a paper by Stringer from 2016, also open access. I'll be putting that, which is a really good summary of the evolution material, the genetics involving introgressions with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, the fossil record, and the various figures going into there, tracking back. But we're talking about at least several 100,000 years for the origin of our species, and farther back to see and the uncertainties about just how which groups are related to what, and the data is not sufficient to be able to resolve it beyond the levels that he's presented. Fine and dandy. Every bit of that information, in principle, is stuff that should need to be accounted for by Jensen in the creationist model. You want to guess how much of it he discusses?
0.
Bingo. You get the golden cigar or whatever it is that we don't give out as actual gifts, but are purely things. And so rather than deal with those data that he brought up but did not discuss, I'll give you a couple guesses to figure where in heck he thought to go next with this. You will You're going to lose this one, Jackson.
Where he went after
Where
bringing
would
up
you think, if
orangutan?
you want, having dangled this chronology matter and mentioning these millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years, where would you think that he might think to go to clinch his case to make his next step?
Arguing about I don't know, that radiometric dating doesn't work or something.
Ah, you're getting closer, but not radiometrics.
Okay.
He actually attempts to show that the whole chronology thing is dicey because of the salt in the ocean and mud on the seafloor.
Are you kidding me?
Nope. This is so gobsmacking that I think we're going to want to include it in rocks too, because it's one of those where you go. So what he did,
That's a
also, remember,
colossally
this is a
bad
book.
argument.
This is a book from 2017, remember. And Lisa just brings up a point. I'll allude to that before we get to that. How do they explain scientific atom and mitochondrial leave not living at the same time, or do they? Oh, they just ignore it. They just don't care. The fact that the things are hundreds of thousands of years apart, they just flick it off, because their Adam and Eve must be 6,000 years ago, simultaneous. No ifs, ands, or buts. No wiggle room here. This is determined by the dogma. So they just kind of waffle that stuff away, in part by not mentioning it, and a lot of their others, or just flicking it aside as well. That it doesn't. All those dates don't matter, because that's the uniformitarian assumption, you see. Anyway, back to salt and mud. Here it is. He's writing this book in 2017. Whoop. Oh, hide message. Got to hit the screen. 2017. He is picking up a 1990 creationist paper by Steve Austin and Russell Humphreys on the salt matter. Almost 30 years old. Like, there hasn't been any work done on this like since then.
No.
And anyway, in the footnote, Jensen puts in, the above reference contains discussion of critics at the end, which he did not describe or mention. It turns out one critic is occurring in this, to where the authors respond to this fellow, a Clarence Meninga, who I guess is a geologist and a Christian, who is not a young Earth creationist, and he was bringing up the obvious exceptions to the problem, that they're forgetting that salt levels reach an equilibrium. That equilibrium can adjust over time depending on microorganisms and things. There's a whole bunch of other elements in the sea all going on at the same time, each with their own equilibrium rates and so forth. So the argument in principle is just dumb. And that's as far as Jensen gets with the salt argument. He doesn't dive into it in any great length. He just dangles it in front of us. And periodically, he's been dropping these creationist sources on us in the footnotes. He doesn't really mention them in the main text, but then he drops them in the references. Well, there's actually been an awful lot of criticism of the salt thing. So I'm going to be putting up a post to a 2005 Ryan McIlroy post, which was criticizing a 1998 Jonathan Sarfati post.
Didn't we talk about that on Apologia's channel last time we were on there?
Yeah, it popped up. And we alluded to it briefly in The Rocks Were There.
Yes.
I think this is relevant because of the other issue, which is a really intriguing one. I'll mention the Ages of Rocks, where he's explicitly criticizing Andrew Snelling, who had done a 2012 posting, which was basically reprising the whole notions of the salt argument, including waiving this 1990 paper from Austin and Humphrey. So it's very, very narrow and incestuous. So I'll be putting all the links in on that. The mud is somewhat more intriguing. Jensen brings in also an old source, 25 years old at the time, Bardem in 1996, which both the Austin paper and the Bardem one, I didn't have in my tip references, probably because they're so crusty old. It was just off my scope. I was dealing with stuff that at least had a 2000 attached to it, not the 1990s. That one is a thing they had presented at one of the creationist conferences, and the PDF is available because all of these various creation conferences, most of the papers of those are available at the ICR and attendant groups to this day, so they're quite accessible. And so that one, it's modeling of deep sea floor sediment, which only touches peripherally on that sediment matter. And then he's also referencing a 2009 book by Snelling, Earth's Catastrophic Past, which is only like 4 pages he's alluding to in the note. The interesting thing about it is that there's been virtually no criticism of this argument in the anti-creationist literature. And I think the reason why is because it's so patently dumb, because it's building on the idea that if you take a coring of a sample of sediment on the seafloor, that's not dating how old the ocean is. That's only dating circumstance of the deposition of that thing. Why? Because within my lifetime, and certainly since the 1970s, it has been obvious the continents move, the plates move, subduction disintegrates stuff, as we alluded to directly in The Rocks Were There,
Indeed.
Volume 1, that very little of the seafloor exists that predates the Cretaceous. And little snippets of it, and I think there's a little teeny sliver of exotic terrain that's left over in the Mediterranean that I think goes back to the Carboniferous or something. It's
Yes.
quite old. It's just a weird blip that nothing in the ocean, oceanic basins don't last that long. Everything that gets deposited close to a continental shelf in a few million years is baby mountain material.
Right.
As the thing all moves on. So the whole thing just falls apart. Oh, let me remind everyone, yes, since Lamont is in the thing, we, Jackson and I and Vandalia, will be talking science in 72 hours over on your channel. Be there, or, well, you don't have to be there, but it would be nice. Well, no, you do have to be there. This is the go-to social event of the season. Forget the Indianapolis 500. Forget all the modern day debates. Here is the place to be. Is that hype? There you go.
I think, yes, I think so.
That's over the top. Anymore, I'll be sounding like I'm. And now, if you order today,
You get a free spoon.
Yes, a free spoon, which you have to buy yourself. Anyway, and so that kind of intrigued me. I asked Colton on our science friends feed on Twitter, had he seen anything about this? Because I was searching through online and there didn't seem to be much of anybody responding to this. And I think that's probably the reason why, is that it's kind of been downplayed a lot. That if you look at Clary and company today, they're not bothering about deep sea floor sediments. No, they're talking about surface sediments, the megasequences. That's all on the land. So they've kind of moved their field precisely because it isn't going to be helping their argument any to deal with all of that. So we'll see whether or not there's any material that pops up betwixt now and the time we allude to it in the book. But it clearly shows, even in 1996, which is after all 20 years after the plate tectonic revolution was getting underway, that our dear pal Jensen was drawing on from 2017, was drawing on a source that was already outdated when it came out in 1996. And the fact that he couldn't reference anybody more recently than that, and I wasn't seeing any recent playing of this in their apologetics literature, suggests, do you really want to bring this up?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one is intriguing because the contrast is quite striking. I mean, there's been a lot of coverage on the salt issue because that all involves stuff that relates to trying to date the ocean by a proxy of the presence of various minerals. And that one is kind of a recurrent perennial. But the seafloor issue, oh, no. So, hey, Brainbug, you're late. But better late than never. We've just been alluding to Nathaniel Jensen attempting to defuse the chronology of orangutan, higher apes, hominids, humans, by undermining the chronology, by undermining the idea that the oceans can be old. And he does this by waving some 1990s papers on salt deposition in the ocean and mud deposition in the ocean. Right. Two very lame, very old arguments, of which the salt matter had been criticized a lot in the anti-creationist literature. But whereas this weird mud deposition argument is so off the wall that it appears to have disappeared completely from the creationist literature, and there's been no anti-creationist discussion of it as a consequence. It's just a non-thing. Anybody out there that can see otherwise, let me know. My Google searching and stuff and brain picking of Colton and others didn't seem to pop up any direct responses to it. And I think precisely because he just died, shriveled up his little ball in the 1990s and didn't go anywhere.
Right.
Yeah. Brainbug rightly notes Jensen is a layman in those fields. Oh, yeah. And it looks like he's a layman in his field of genetics, too, if you really start to think about it. As Dan Stern Cardinale, go over, they make the weirdest of arguments that you go, how can anybody that's in this field make the kinds of discussions and inferences they do from the data field? But anyway, that's the part one issue. The part two issue is another geology related one, which concerns Michael Oard, a 2019 posting of his, which I'll be sticking that up, which tries to show that glacial striations aren't old events and that they don't need to be from a glacier. So he cites a new paper on rock avalanches from Hu et al., which also is available open access, so I'll be putting the link up to that. It has a tiny snag for Ord's argument, because what you could see in there are little teeny sections of ground where there's little scrapes in them that are reminiscent of what you see in glaciation, where you have a gigantic glacier that's grinding rocks slowly and relentlessly off a huge landscape. And so you have these striations, vast parallel strings of them. And you can see them in lots of places. Anybody who lives in New York can see pieces of that in Central Park, because there's old glacial rock that's exposed up in there. At no point did this 2019 paper assert that the striations they were seeing were or accounted for glacial deposits, glacial formations. Just that, they remind you a little what glaciers do. But you think about it, you've got a bunch of rocks slamming downhill in an avalanche. Is it surprising that some of them could make little teeny sprinkles that are like striations? And here's a further problem, is that if you have avalanches, that generates heat. So if you try to put too much scrunched into too little of time, isn't that going to be generating a lot of heat? Are we going to be calculating that, Ord? I don't think so. Why are they getting into the troubles for it? Well, it's because of the existence of Precambrian ice ages. You remember the creationist mantra, and boy, is it a mantra. When Andrew Snelling tried to imply there might be more than one flood, that got him into trouble. I don't think any serious creationist tries to defend that there was more than one ice age. It's got to be the ice age. Functionally now they've moved it down. I think the consensus view in creationists, and again, if somebody is more familiar with that area and I'm making a goof, let me know. But my reading of it is that they pretty much decided that the ice ages are happening at the end and a little after the flood. That it's really primarily a post-flood thing, because the water has to go away and then you've got these glaciers forming and things running around. And all this is literally happening in like years.
Right.
The mammoths are appearing after Tower of Babel and then getting flash frozen. So all of this stuff is happening somewhere really fast and furious. But they can't allow any ice ages before that. So Nephilim Free, in my debate that I had him a ways back, he was utterly sure that I think it was with Nephilim. At any rate, in the side chat and that it was coming up as well, that the Silurian ice age, I think it was with Nephilim, that the Silurian ice age down in India, oh, wait a minute, I'm having a brain fart on that. It was a debater that I was discussing on the Indian matter. McLean, maybe, not McLean, the other guy. I'm gibbering here. I apologize. It's 95 degrees here, kids.
Anyway, RJ, that's what we get on the weekends. What are you talking about?
Yeah, and plus you got sauna humidity back there. But anyway, The thing is that the ice age at the tip of India didn't happen when India was where it is now. It was in the southern hemisphere, and it was 300 million years ago, and it was at the South Pole, and all of that made perfect sense. But the thing is that the creationist was absolutely McLaren, I think it was, that was insisting that it had to be Pleistocene in age.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because only one ice age.
Right.
Well, they get into the same problem with Precambrian. Worse, because theoretically the Silurian is taking place during the flood, and the Mesozoic is taking place during the flood. All of that's floody stuff in their model. Whereas Precambrian rocks are, by virtually every creationist measure, creation week rocks before the flood. So the perfect world can't have ice ages at all, period.
Right.
So they have to reframe all Precambrian ice ages. And they, oops. As if you can't snow slush is water, then snowball Earth 600 million years ago was kind of like a flood covering the Earth, but that's 600 million years older than the YEC1. Well, if all we need to do is add lots of zeros to Noah's age, maybe, a year is as 1,000 years. So maybe we can push everybody in Adam and Eve back into the Cambrian.
I mean, isn't that what?
Why not?
Isn't that what Rana does?
Yeah, kinda. Well, it's not as bad as the great offenders here would be Cremo and Thompson, which we're going to be alluding to. I don't think we brought them up much in Rocks 1. I'd have to check my index. Somebody who's got the thinking tech on. But Cremo and Thompson are Hare Krishna Hindu style anti-evolutionists. So for them, billions of years old people are no problem.
Right.
And so they have an amazing, I think it's called Forbidden Archaeology. It came out in the 1990s. Yeah. It rings a horrible bell. Erica knows about it too. She's bumped into it kind of in the side. It plays a weird little role in creationist apologetics because they're heretics. They are not Christians, and certainly not young Earth Christians. So they are odd to work with, but they're also circulating because of their problems with the fossils and problems with Neanderthal man and blah, 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 and out of place artifacts and things going on. And so it's an enticing mine of congenial claptrap that pops up in a variety of circles. The super civilizations and Atlantis groupies and space alien crowds, they kind of intersect with Cremo and Thompson. And so there's an awful lot of overlap going on here. When you get down past the doctrinal castles at ICR and AIG and all of that, into the nitty gritty, where you have people who think no more clearly than Standing for Truth or Nephilim Free, who just latch on to stuff because it fits in the thing. Paul Valentine says, Cremo is an idiot. That is a terrible insult to idiots. I think that, retract that, sir. He is beneath an idiot. Both Cremo and Thompson, they have, I don't recommend it unless you have the stomach for it, but it's a fascinating mishmash. The books that they've written, the Forbidden Archaeology is really long. It's, I think, 600, 700, 800 pages. It's quite long, which our book is longer, but ours has substance. And it's even by the standards of the period. It's gone through a revision, by the way. I think the original one came out like 1992 or somewhere in there, and I think they've done a 2005 version, which I have not actually seen. So if anybody has seen that kind of a thing, I will say anybody that does videos who has that book available and wants to jump on it from a source methods direction, have at it. Do exactly what I've done, which just is to take the book and go through the source claims item by item by item. It'll fill up a long time because they actually alluded to an awful lot of stuff along the way, and do it as a documentation because it can be rather handy. I don't think anyone has really done, there's been piecemeal criticism of Cremo all over the place. There's been stuff at the National Center of Science Education and Talk Origins, and there are, I think, a couple websites that have been fascinated with it, but I think an up-to-date source analysis of their crap would be entirely warranted to do. So if anybody out there wants to take the plunge, holding your nose all the time, that one I would recommend for it. David H., the bar was low and they brought a shovel. Yes, that's pretty much it. And you can tell, if I had to pick an ice age, it would be the Little Ice Age. Ooh, the Little Ice Age has to do with a climate, but that pops up in another future project that Jackson and I will be dealing with.
Yeah, the Little Ice Age is kind of a misnomer. Well, I would say it really is a misnomer.
Yeah.
It,
It's a thing that's occurring primarily, as I recall, in the northern hemisphere. That overall, the rest of the planet wasn't doing it. It was just a localized
yes.
area.
It was, I think it was like the North Atlantic Current or something along those lines.
Yeah.
If I remember
And they're
correctly.
still tinkering with all the dynamics of how that worked out. Remember, we have one big thing that makes climatology really tricky, and that is oceans. And the way heat gets circulated in them and at various layers, and how the components of life that's going on in there, and the amount of runoff, and the positioning of the continents, and whether there's feedback loops with ice ages versus ice versus tundra, and blah 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 blah, tons of things. As ice ages disappear, Earth rebounds because of isostasy, so that changes the amount of water at the shelf, and it changes. It's a huge, complicated problem, and that's why anybody that's dived into climatology over the last 20 years can see how they've been gradually figuring in all of those various components. Lisa says she watches Ancient Aliens sometimes just for the laughs. Yeah, or tears. It can be both. That too is perfectly adequate as source analysis. I don't get cable now, so I don't have to bother. I don't have the option to watch Ancient, although I suppose some of it must be on YouTube somewhere, but I'm not going to be hanging around for it. Brainbug says it was more so the death of the medieval warm period. Before that, you could farm in Greenland. Yeah, it was, and that overall shifting that was taking place 1200, 1300, 1200, 1300 period had a much more complicated effect that was going on, because in that same period, you've got climate shifts going on in the Anasazi culture and in the Southwest that's just decimating crop levels over there. Rain patterns are changing and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, Greenland was the closest to it got to being green at that time. And it's no coincidence that the exploration of the New World by the Vikings was taking place at a time of relative hiatus. And then as the climate started to get colder and colder, it and returned to its otherwise mode, it closed off places. There were times when the passes through the Alps closed off from icing and that. So these little micro fluctuations that have been gone into are of relevance for today, because what dynamics is no one is accusing fossil fuel manufacturers and automobiles to be contributing to any of these climate shifts that were happening in the past. It's all purely natural phenomenon, but it does involve how feedback loops get going, and how one thing that happens somewhere can affect something that's something somewhere else. Volcanic eruptions, all these other factors. And so the idea that when we are coming in and putting in factors that are comparable to things that happened in the past, that can have potential facts that you can study the past to figure out what's going on with the newest model. So there we go. Vandalius heard it was caused a little ice age that caused the ice in the Delaware during the famous crossing, because there's usually no ice in it nowadays. Things oscillate back and forth over things. There are one of the reasons why I think Bruegel were painting pictures of like frozen rivers is because it was like a new thing. And you have instances of where the Thames would freeze over. And so you get these micro fluctuations over time where things can be in one context and 200 years later are very, very different, and people have forgotten all about them. And you have, we know that the Krakatoa eruption had a little bit of an effect on the climate. The one from Mount Tambora, or whatever it was in 1815 or so, that produced the Year Without a Summer in New
Oh,
England,
yes.
and it was snowing in July, and all of that. That's directly traceable to a big volcanic eruption in that extremely tectonically active Indonesia thing, and where most of the world's active volcanoes are. Even places that have a lot of volcanoes can't hold a candle to Indonesia. But that's bearing in mind that the current research is therefore working, especially with like proxy data and the like of isotope balances and foraminifera data and all this other stuff, to gradually extend the impact of previous volcanic eruptions on climate. And the fact that this would have been going on all through time, so we could figure out that if somebody comes along and takes a sampling of a period where there was a cooling or a warming, and not realizing that could be a blip caused by a volcanic eruption or some other event, that they would think it's a trend when it's just an anomaly. And so it's what makes paleoclimate such an interesting field. And so it makes you think we could still be in the little ice age if the industrial age hadn't happened. That was, in fact, part of the brief spurt that you still find popping up in climate researchers about the scientists were predicting the renewed ice age in the 1970s. Well, most of them weren't. But remember, what you had, no. But when you understood the context of what they were seeing, it was understandable a few might take that position. Because what we got with the ice age is the place was really cold. It had really huge temperature fluctuations from cold to really, really cold, from less really cold to more really cold, until around 10,000 years ago when it went boop, like this. And we've had tiny little wiggles ever since. Way smaller temperature fluctuations in the post-ice age world 10,000 years on than was occurring during the ice age itself, but at a much higher temperature rate.
I will say, RJ, in the 70s was when ExxonMobil was doing research. They were actually doing climate research.
Oh yeah, they knew
to see what the future effects of climate change were going to be. And after they realized that there were going to be some serious effects of climate change, they decided, oh no, we're not going to worry about this. We're going to lobby so that a bunch of politicians, will listen to us, not listen to scientists.
Yeah, well, what happened was the climate data, and there's a famous Newsweek thing that gets trotted out to this day from the 1970s, which has a little chart which shows the temperatures are dropping in the climate data. I think some of it was from Greenland and others through the 1960s. And this was taken by some climatologists as a fear that we were resuming the ice age mode, because typically interglacial periods run around 10,000 years. And so the idea that we had an ice age and we were in the warm phase, and here we might be going back into the cold phase. So this was not a loony idea. But what was ironic about it is even in that chart where the curve is dropping, and at the very bottom, there's a little teeny hookup, tiny little hookup. Well, if you look at a modern temperature chart of the years since then, all that data was correct. And that little hook up was, in fact, the first beginning of an up and 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 an up into our present thing. So that's why, as you move towards the now, fewer and fewer people are going, well, looks like we're going into an ice age. And no, we're going into a warming period. And wait a minute, aren't we pumping a bunch of greenhouse gases? Maybe we should think more about that, shall we? And that's exactly.
Just like the start of the renewal of the anti-vax movement, it was a con that got out of control again.
Yeah, you have interest groups who have and pseudoscience lovers, and sometimes the same people. It's no coincidence that Fred Singer, who is telling us that smoking cigarettes is not a problem for you, and by the way, I'm being paid by the tobacco lobby, moved over to saying climate change is not a big problem, and my checks are now coming from the oil industry.
Yeah.
There's a lot, and they still there's another thing that we see, and it pops up as a parallel track in anti-evolutionism. Small, often pay-for-play journals that act as hosts to the woo. So you've got Journal of Theoretical Biology, where Sanford and Company will still find places to publish in some of their technical papers, and you find
some of the
Elsevier
journals.
Yeah, exactly. Which have low standards and fail to meet them.
Yeah.
Woo. Yeah, and so from
just
all
check
of this
their
stuff is fabulous. Yeah, go ahead.
Their score. I was just gonna say, go check their. If you're ever wondering, just go check their impact score.
Yeah.
Journal.
And the other thing is from a source methods direction. Back to topic. It is a gold mine of analytical usage, because people are making claims in print with footnotes or not that have references that they assert are supporting claim X, and you can look them up and find out whether they are as they stack up to be. In some cases, they may be unreliable sources that everybody's just channeling. In other cases, they may be legitimate sources that are being misrepresented. All of that is grist for the scholar's mill. And we're going to be diving into that with a vengeance in the conspiracy book, because one method rules them all. It's like the ring in Lord of the Rings that you get. My contention, and we'll see whether Jackson buys into this completely, there's really only one really serious way of thinking wrong. And it's that you have to have a mind that can easily pay attention to sources that say what you want to be true, and a mind that easily doesn't bother fact checking them and is insulated against ever changing their minds. All the principles that we laid out in the rocks were there as the basic rule to bad reasoning. And that any group, very different demographics, they can be different age groups, they can be different politics, but if they're believing something that you're going, no, it's the same method.
No. Sure.
And sometimes you'll see the overlap where if they're bad method in one area, the odds are they're probably going to be bad method in some other area. And we've seen this with a vengeance in the number of people orbiting the Trumplandia world, which brings in weird white racists and weird anti-vaxxers and weird this and that and thus and such, and of course younger creationists and people in the Tony Perkins branch, and then there's a orbiting blob from the Heritage Society that overlaps with the creationists, but also with a bunch of neocon, and you get into a just as evolution is a series of population genes and predator-prey relationships and so forth. The world of woo is an often intersecting blob of various interest groups with various obsessions, but underlying it all, just as genetics is at the root of things and mutations and things that you can measure, so too you're ultimately looking at how their bad scholarly method yields crap. And it's the same little warning flags that pop up on every single one. So we have to do our job to always rely upon primary sources and never misrepresent them, to reflect when things are a legitimate controversy because the data is insufficient to resolve it, and which ones are pretend controversies that do not have two competing sides. They have the thing that's true and then the ideology that doesn't want it to be true and cherry picks to make it appear as if it's true. And as Fox Trump Pravda and Newsmax and Oanon and various other news outlets that will bring them on as guests and talking heads and never ask them critical questions and smile sagely or look like he swallowed a bug confused like Tucker Carlson. And away we go.
Yes.
Oh, David H. Yes. Yeah, these it mentions last week tonight did a segment on how cheap and easy it is to pay these news companies to help them sell anything, no matter how BS it is or scam. There's a bit of a flap that's popping out on the political side in relation to a Republican pollster who basically was paid by various Republicans to poll conclusions that they wanted to be the conclusions. And he would just hunt around until he could find the right demographics and things to and cherry pick and carefully do the answers. The Discovery Institute uses exactly the same thing. They've I don't know that they do it all that often lately, but at least in the 2010 period on for quite a few years, they would spew out polls that they would have conducted that have very carefully worded questions that are designated to arrive at the ballpark that they want to do. And sort of question like, how old do you think the Earth is? Or do you think there's a reason for ALU mutations? No, those are not the sort of questions you're going to get them asking.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah. And so the, remember, I think it was Mark Twain who said there's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
And I took statistics last semester, so I know all about that.
Yeah, that they're a fabulously valuable tool. At the same time, you can be misleading from them. For example, we can take this as a concrete example from the COVID catastrophe and how it threw a lot of people out of work. So unemployment, went up.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have unemployment going up 50, 60, 80, 100%, and then you have them going back to work, you have a value that's going up seemingly faster than the value going down. That it takes more than 100% return to employment rate to get to the level it was if you had a 100% drop in employment or 50% or whatever. That if you had 100% unemployment rate, nobody's.
Right.
But you can have 100% rise in employment. So you can have an employment rate. But just imagine if you have 10 people are out of work, and then it jumps to 20 people out of work. You have a 100% increase in unemployment. And if you go from that 20 people out of work back to 10 people out of work, you only have a 50% change in value. So if you want to highlight the one number versus the other, depending upon which political party you are, you can highlight that. But always deal with what real numbers are. There was one that came up in the anti-vaxxer thing. One of the things that Naomi Wolf was retweeting. I've taken to following her on. We were discussing before the show came on. Naomi Wolf is one of the 10 core groups, and in fact, since some of them are married couples, you've actually only got about 6 or 7 clusters of people that were literally generating like 65% of all the content that was being repeated on websites for anti-vaxxer COVID hysteria crap. Just from those clusters of people, and it was just being metastasized. Anyway, I've taken to following Wolf on Twitter now to see the vomit of tweets that she puts out, and one of them was a retweet of somebody that was pointing out the difference between California and Texas on lockdowns. And so they've got 2021, and they got the percentage increases, and then they got 21 on the other side. And you go, wait a minute, we're only in June of 2021. That's not a whole year. The data wouldn't be for the whole year. You're trying to compare rates for a portion of a year with an entire year. Wait a minute. And also, are you taking into account the fact that there were people who were violating the mask rules and the lockdown rules? There were people that were going to the beach when they were recommending not to. There were all sorts of things that were happening. There was a drop in tourism in Florida because people weren't going down there. And so that was changing the amount of people knocking around. All of those variables would need to be taken into account. And there was no indication that that little factoid sign paid attention to any of that stuff. So whenever you have somebody that's being overly selective and isn't offering primary sources and not trying to wait for the dust to settle, you get this vomit of tweets, just a barrage of doubts, problems, and attacks on Fauci, just virulent attacks on Fauci. And one person made the mistake of saying, history's going to be amazed thinking why people were taking Fauci seriously. And I said, no, they're not. As a historian myself, they will settle all the dust out and be somewhat saddened that so many people could have believed the claptrap about Fauci that you apparently do.
Yeah, well,
I was a little more polite in wording it, but nonetheless,
that was the fact that we've gotten over other diseases using vaccines would have helped this one, but no, apparently not.
Well, an awful lot of them just don't remember anything about it, and they cherry pick their information. I have kind of a personal connection to this, just as you have a personal connection to appendectomy. So the section that we did on appendicitis and the evolutionary nature of the appendix was kind of particularly interesting to you because you had an appendicitis attack. So you knew about this.
Yeah.
I've never had that. But in my case, my mother almost died of the Spanish influenza in 1919. So this is not a trivial matter as to how pandemics work and how mask use and all that comes in. David H. points out that YEC do enough straw manning for all sides. Oh yeah, that's the other problem of what you happen when you have that tunnel vision world, is that you're letting one side tell you both sides of the issue, so that the person who's the creationist or the political ideologue or the anti-vaxxer or the fill-in-the-blanker, flat earther, Holocaust denier, the whole bunch of things, the Kennedy assassination groupies, there's just Bigfoot, that they're relying on the one side to tell them their evidence and to characterize the opposing side's argument. And so what it amounts to, as I discovered in my research and Jackson discovered independently in his. And when we combined forces for the rocks were there, we discovered on steroids is that you can't trust a Tortugan ideologue to play fair with the data field. That they
These are the
will
facts.
that they will inevitably be searching for the laser pointer, the thing that they want to be true. And even if they're semi-honest about it, in that they're not consciously trying to misrepresent data sources. They just see the little nugget and pick it up, and they don't care about anything else, taking it wildly out of context. There are some instances where they really should know better. Snelling and Purdom and others are too trained in their disciplines that you have to say, wait a minute. You have to be consciously deciding not to bring this issue up. And that means that there's the apologetic angle to it. Snelling has pretty much admitted the idea that he's there to make the Christian creationist case. And his job is to just tell you the things that fit that. And it's probably no surprise that so many lawyers get involved in the thing, going all the way back into the early days of creationism, but down into Philip Johnson at the Discovery Institute. He's a big shot head now, the big shot lawyer at Berkeley, very politically conservative, got religion after a divorce and jumped on the intelligent design bandwagon and basically helped pull all of that together as a movement. Enormously influential character. But he comes at it. Imagine if you're a lawyer and you imagine your client is God. Wow. Don't you have a lot of incentive to make the best case you can for God in whatever ways you can, and never once call attention to any evidence that isn't making your client look good?
Right.
And so that lawyer mentality is the matter of the apologist. Plus, when you get into it's not exclusive to Christian apologetics, but certainly has been studied. There was somebody who wrote a whole book on Martin Luther King and noticed the connection that he had with the Christian tradition of stealing text, expropriating text without attribution in the preacher community is just rampant. It's not something that's seen as a thing that's a problem. And so you could get into that. And if you get into that preacher mode, and politicians can get into it too. Joe Biden had gotten into a big flap in one of his earliest campaigns for president because he lifted a bunch of quotations from somebody else and didn't give attribution to them. I mean, he agreed with them, but it didn't dawn on him that he should allude to something that was not his wording. He was borrowing somebody else's thought. And that's what quotation marks were invented for, gang.
Right.
And I love giving credit where credit is due, especially if somebody describes something way better than I can, that I just let them go with it. And I want them to get the credit for it so that people can look at it and say what a clever thing it is. If we can word it better than they can, if we can come up with a better argument than they can, then we will do it ourselves. Thank you very much. But the idea of lifting source material with that mode, it can happen in a lot of different people. And there's even flaps. Stern Goodwin, the Civil War and other historian. She's written a bunch of books. She's occasionally gotten stuff that people have complained that she was taking some stuff out of context and drawing on things without proper attribution. So it's an easy, slippery slope to do, especially if you've been at it a long time and your mind is blurred as you get older to the point where you've forgotten what was your wording and what was somebody else's, and you hadn't written down the details of it properly. And those sorts of things can happen. To err is human. To correct requires sound method. And so what we've strived to do, if we've made any goofs, we may goofs. But we strive at every turn, and Jackson can attest to this directly, of how we interact to peg everything down and to make sure that even the most trivial little point, we've got it grounded to where we know where we got the stuff from, and we're fairly representing the stuff. And so once in a while, it's a case where we actually have revised the texts so that it fairly represents that there's been some controversy in that area, and so forth and so on. We want to put all that material out. And because it's a contact sport, and it's a living contact sport, it's done by human brains that can be fallible. It can be driven by desires, pet theories. It's not just in science, but history. You wouldn't even think this, but mathematics can get into the same kind of a thing, where people have their pet hypotheses that they haven't yet been able to prove, but they're sure it's right. You had a bit of this. No religion discussion about predestination for Calvinists could have reached the level of vituperation that you would get in regarding the tussle over the proof of Fermat's last theorem, because it was that probably, oh gosh, a couple hundred years worth of these mathematicians ever had tried to prove the damn thing, or prove that it can't be proven, that it's a false hypothesis. And it was only, and worse, a relatively minor mathematician figured it out, building on lots of mathematics that wasn't known in Fermat's day. He was back in the 17th century, I think. And that initially his first try, in fact, to get the proof had a glitch in it, so he had to go back to the drawing board, and then he finally figured it out. So the idea that in any discipline, you can get into cliques and factions, and things can get politicized. The one that really jumps out, and I think in the reading that you've been doing lately, you've probably been skirting at the edge of this, Jackson, all of the squabbles between Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins, and the various camps that were going on over.
I mean, in some ways, in other ways, they're remarkably similar. I'm reading, it's funny because I'm actually, so my free time book that I'm reading right now is Ever Since Darwin by Stephen Jay Gould. And the book that I'm reading for the series is The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins. So I'm actually reading both of them kind of side by side, and they have a lot, I mean, to their credit, they have a lot of ideas because they're both evolutionary biologists that are in, pretty good concert.
And it's some of it was just snagging up over terminology, that they would have different focus, and that would then escalate all out of things. Plus,
that was the whole thing about the gene-centric view, was Dawkins, the way Dawkins framed it. Yeah.
And he has now evolved to where I have literally heard him in person saying that he never thought or never claimed that the selfish gene was other than a metaphor. And you're going, what? 40 years ago, you were. It was way more than a metaphor.
It's like, it has to be metaphorical, because it's not a gene which gets passed on. It's the whole genome. If you want to be overly reductive, you can say there's a gene, quote,
organisms reproduce, genes don't. Although, to some extent, they can inveigle and get their little edge in to where they get passed along, but not in a common selection thing. And so those polarities, it just is that the cliche that was only partly true, that Darwin was a hyper-gradualist, and what would now be called sympatric speciation guy, when in fact, no, he was actually flirting with ideas. They just didn't have enough information to even conceptualize them. What we would now call allopatric speciation. He was well aware of the idea that geographical range would have played a role in that, in the same way that he was saddled with natural selection when he also had footnote sexual selection, and that kind of got lost in the shuffle on these things. So an area that's popping up that's fresh in my mind because it relates to volume 2 of The Rocks Were There has to do with to what extent did evangelicals and religious people embrace a young earth prior to the modern young earth creationist movement.
Right.
And it turns out it's way more nuanced than that. You did find in the 19th century some holdouts who were stamping their feet and objecting to all of the big time geology stuff. But in fact, there was a wide range of people who had no problem with it one way or the other, and were able to try to work out how that connected up with the ballpark of 6,000 years-ish. And that, too, is another factor, that even the creationists are well aware of the fact that if you just try to add up the varying versions of who begat whom at what age, you don't come up with a single number. You have hundreds and maybe even thousands of years range you can wiggle room around, to where you have 19th and 18th century scholars who were coming up with dates that were hundreds of years off on the Exodus from where even the conventional traditionalist one is. So what had happened with the younger creationists is they're coming at it from a much narrower blob of apologists who are riffing off of Ellen White's Seventh-day Adventism, coming from a very conservative thing that was coming after the formation of the fundamentalist movement in the early 20th century. And they're just cherry picking a particular narrow branch. It's exactly like, I suddenly had an epiphany here. It is exactly like the creationist, the occultists who cherry picked their version of the occult tarot because one particular deck was played in the south of France. And they made all of their occult theories based on that one little filter. It's precisely the same phenomenon as how a very narrow set of doctrinists who now were fixated on the 4004 BC and the 2350 flood and the 1500 Exodus, all of those little benchmark dates that, never mind that if they had lived 100 years earlier, there would have been a huge disagreement as to how precise you could get with those dates, even among the most devout of Christians. And they didn't know about any of that because they're just coming from a little narrow branch, Rimmer and finally Henry Morris and that crowd. And then they tidy it up even more because even though they were getting this stuff from George McCready Price and the Adventist creationists, you find ICR and AIG just stamping their foot, denying flat out there was any influence that Morris got any of that stuff from those nasty Adventists. Well, poo.
Sorry,
anyway,
we have the paper trail.
Yep, indeed of it. David, I think of it like, imagine someone mentioned your most passionate subject. You could talk about it for days on end. Yes. In fact, coming up later in the month, John Richards, who is building up a podcast thing and an atheist discussion, and he's had some really big guns, Richard Dawkins and others on his guests. I'm going to be a guest on his show on, I think, the 29th.
Nice.
Somewhere. I'll be putting information up on it. And we sat up until the wee hours of the morning. It was just before lunch Britain time, but it was getting way past dawn at my end of it. But we went a couple hours, and he was discovering that I have a lot of interests.
A few, yeah, just a few.
Yeah, just a few. And one thing leads to another. So we'll be discussing matters about atheism and the woke aesthetic and some of the downsides of overly doctrinal positions on things. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and I may be the curator for this project, this web project that's designed to work on smartphones and tablets and others of a virtual interactive thing where you can go and talk to people and connect up with a variety of things. And I'm slated to participate as a cinema curator to suggest interesting films and that relate to a lot of things, because you can get a lot of philosophy issues from various motion pictures, and it can relate to issues about evolution and the nature of life and religion and politics and culture and the role of science and all of that in some of the most eccentric spots where you realize, yeah, that's kind of about that issue too. And when you find out who wrote the movies and you know the background of their productions and the time frame that they were being done in, it takes on a broader context of stuff. So I'll be pushing for the idea of having a bigger sense of the context, the history context of just about any topic. There isn't a subject that doesn't have a history to it. People are not inventing things out of thin air all on their own. Everybody has the baggage of their family and their culture and the whole civilization behind them, and they have their particular obsessions and interests and specializations, and each one of those has the baggage floating around out about it. And the more you know about it, the more you can appreciate the insights of it, as well as point out, yeah, there's a little odd point in there. Look at the homophobia that was in that thing, or look at the racial prejudice that was in that kind of a movie. And then you can see that some of the things that jump out as racial prejudice today, in the context of when the movie was made, was anything but. It was seen as being liberal, where you were less racist in this depiction than other people might have been. And we don't necessarily spot that today because we're coming from a different perspective.
RJ, I think that is a good point, that like everything has a history. Like the people on the far right who are always throwing around the term cultural Marxist, when that was like originally a Nazi invention, that wasn't it?
Yeah, well, and the Germans have a weird political tradition to this day, where they've got parties that are just almost oxymoronic in terms. I mean, I can't think of one right off the hand, but it would be the equivalent of the conservative anarchist party. That you're mixing things together, just as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. There's people, Dinesh D'Souza tries to make a big aim out of this, that this is socialism. Well, not really, because all the real socialists all got carted away. So somehow or other, whatever the socialism is, it was a generic socialism, because we have to remember the German Empire had been founded in Bismarck's era with a lot of what we would consider socialist programs, old age pensions and health system, a national education system. And that's where they got in their big Kulturkampf war with the Catholic Church over the idea of parochial education and the idea that the state should be doing all of this. So there was a background within the German Empire and the Weimar Republic that related to social service issues that were very different from worker ownership of the means of production and nationalization of factories, which is where socialism would be coming into the picture. And the Nazis ran off of that. The original party was not founded by Hitler. He came in as a spy, as the German military wanted to find out about these various groups, and they were infiltrating communist groups and people all over the place. And they sent Hitler in as a spy to monitor the Nazi party. And he took it over. And because it was National Socialists, which means it was German socialism, it's German meaning Aryan, meaning non-Jewish socialism, and not the nasty Marxism of the Jews, Marx and others. And so that's where it got transmogrified into an anti-Semitic, thug beat-up people party that got him into trouble when he had the putsch in 1923 or 4, and got him landed in jail. And that's where he wrote Mein Kampf as his little fan fiction book that came out afterwards, and then got appointed gradually. They never got elected into power. They got appointed into power. So there's a brief historical link. We'll be alluding to some of this stuff in Rocks 2 because of the fact that it's a trope obsessively with the intelligent design movement, but also over in the Jerry Bergman branch of young Earth creationism, that Nazis, evolutionists, eugenics, evolutionism, Darwinism, racism, those tropes we constantly bump into people who trot those out. And it's an egregious misrepresentation of an awful lot of stuff that downplays the actual processes that lead to tyrannies and prejudices and holocausts. And natural selection in the environment is not really the driver of what was going wrong in that movement. So, Lisa says, wasn't Hitler an Austrian? Yeah, technically speaking, he was not even a German. He came from Austria. And so technically he only became a real German in the sense when Germany annexed Austria in 1938 and brought it into the thing. And Anton Weber, and the modernist composer, said, "Oh, now we'll hear Mahler again." And if you're going, no, Mahler is a Jew. They're not going to be wanting to play Jew music. They didn't even like Mendelssohn because he was converted. I mean, who could complain about Mendelssohn? Yet he was verboten because he was Jewish ancestry, and they were really. It was a terrible thing for poor Anton Bruckner, who had died in 1896. Because he wrote big Wagnerian symphonies. The Germans, as Nazis, just played him up like mad and played him and Beethoven a lot. And there were a lot of special editions and tidied up notes and stuff that came out during the Nazi years. And so for some time after the war, Bruckner kind of had a pall of gloom over him as a composer, precisely because of the fact that the Nazis had played him up so much. But after a while, when you started getting into the 70s and 80s and let the dust settle and people actually just started to listen to the music and figure out where he was going on. He's an extraordinary and interesting composer, huge influence on Mahler. And just as Mahler was an enormous influence on Shostakovich. And so you got the long thread. See, I have digressed again. I can't help myself, kids.
We did it, folks.
Yeah, it is. Oh, anyway, so we're a little bit past the hour. If anybody has any, okay, Lisa for Truth, Kent still thinks an ichthyosaur is a fish. Oh, that's sad.
I mean, but it's Kent though, so you know.
Yeah, that's he has. I mean, he thinks that the broccoli is evidence for creation. So I mean, what else can you do?
I mean, is he? Well, what was it? Is he wrong though? We created broccoli, therefore.
Well, yes, there it is. It's a creation. So we're gods. Oh, I think that's a conclusion jump you wouldn't want to take on that.
Wasn't that a book by like Isaac Asimov that like humans attained a godlike status?
Yeah. We dealt with an awful lot, and there was the notion of the ability to model social systems scientifically that shows up in the Foundation series. That, from my point of view, from the Gould world of things, I'd go, nice try, Isaac, but that's probably impossible. So it makes for fun stories and all that. Asimov was a fascinating little character. He wrote an analysis of the Bible, and so did Steve Allen. There's one that the former host of the Tonight Show before Johnny Carson. For those of you who don't know Steve Allen, this is ancient stuff. He was a remarkable intellectual, definitely part of the freethinker, non-religious movement. His criticism of the Bible is hilarious. It's deft and witty. Married to Jane Meadows, who was a much more conservative actress, less politically left than he was. But anyway, Allen was a songwriter, a comic, and they did a show. He and his wife did a TV show way back in PBS, I think in the 70s or 80s, Meeting of Minds or some such thing. It was like a little half-hour show where they would have actors portray historical figures, because I remember Jane Meadows played Cleopatra one episode. And they would have them on as like chat show guests, and they would be talking about the history of their life and all of that stuff. And it was really inventive material. So Steve Allen is somebody that from the freethinker movement deserved more attention than you might think, because he was a mixture of talent and culture and humor. And another connector, Ernie Kovacs, who is just an amazing, weird sight gag comedian, but also tremendously sophisticated. There was an episode of one of his shows, because we always watched Ernie Kovacs when he had TV shows on. And we're talking about the 1960s, because I think he died in a car accident in the early 60s. And there was a whole episode where he took Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra and did a tone poem visual to it as an episode of his show. I mean, you're going, wow, this is sophisticated material. He was a fascinating character. Was he the one that married his daughter later on in life? Oh my gosh, I don't think so. I think that's a different Allen. Anyway, Steve Allen is a remarkably interesting little character. And we got people reading Australian, not Austrian. Well, there's the problem, because all Ost means is outer land, like Auslander, and then there's the as opposed to Ost, which means east. And so it's just a name that was given to it for the same reason that Japan, nobody in Japan calls Japan Japan. It's Nippon. I mean, nobody in München says Munich, and nobody outside of Oregon would say Oregon. So there you go.
I heard someone say that, RJ, and it threw me for a loop.
Berate them. But because out here in the West, we flatten our A's, so it's Colorado, not Colorado, and we get and Spokane, because some people in the early 20th century wanted to make it sound fancier. They stuck an E on the end, because it's the Spokane Indians, and it was originally spelled without the E. Well, it didn't dawn on them that when you look at a word and you look at it from a French pronunciation point of view, it makes the vowel long. So people would say Spokane, like rhymes with Citizen Kane. And that was an understandable mistake that grates on our ears. No, it's Spokane. Well, why the hell has it got an E on the end?
RJ, when I heard Oregon, it was in Wisconsin, actually.
Yeah.
I was
well,
at the
way you counter that was to say, okay, so you're from Cleveland, Ohio?
You're in what?
If you pronounce Cleveland, Ohio in a different way.
Cleveland, Ohio? Is that what you said?
Yeah. I mean, couldn't you pronounce it that way? Ohio?
I mean...
you didn't know how it was worked. And another problem has to do with the fact that a lot of the names in the Pacific Northwest are Indian names. That throws everybody up as well. And so you got Puyallup and Yakima and all the time. People say Yakima when they look at that, and that just makes and then there's Coeur d'Alene, which is French. That's pops in, and so it makes it very, very complicated. Which is the reason why Washington State is here, to make life miserable for everybody around there, because of this mishmash of names and terminologies. And
RJ, have you seen how my state is spelled versus how it's pronounced? Have you seen it?
And Natchitoches, which looks like Nacogdoches or whatever down there.
Well, there's Nacogdoches in Texas, and Natchitoches, which in Louisiana. You're right, it looks like Natchitoches in Louisiana, but it's
So you see this complicated word on there, which I think is another Indian name, that is not pronounced anything remotely. Well, the French have a tendency to just change letters anywhere. Somebody was joking about the fact that they've been gradually removing all the consonants in French. So you have your and Jesus Christ is becoming Jesus Christ. And so they're just removing all of the consonants.
Terrible. But very true. It's very true.
We're going to get nasty people call it, as opposed to the Germans, who are far too consonant for their own good, and all of the Germans with all of the umlauts and all the other kinds of things in there. So we've been politically incorrect enough in here. We're 15 minutes past the hour. I didn't even try. Oh, yes, I'm not going to pronounce that one either. That could get us demonetized. That is, if I were monetized to begin with. So it really doesn't matter. But we don't want to think about that one at all. That's the point. We got to end the show. That's enough. We've done the whole bit on that. Can't beat that. See you all next week. Everybody who hasn't been vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you bump into people who haven't been vaccinated, don't. So watch out for things like that, because there's still way too many people that aren't doing that, and the virus keeps mutating, and so we cannot say we're out of the woods until remember the 1918 pandemic had two phases, in 18 and 19. So the idea that you can have another surge later on if not enough people get vaccinated, and you can't get into that 70% range when it starts minimizing the capacity of the virus to spread. So stay safe, kids. Don't accept any wooden penguins. Buy our books. And Paralogs of Fogs too. I'm just reading through the master text in that to get everything buffed up to get to my conclusion on that. So hopefully this year there's going to be the second Paralogs novel. I really do intend on that being. So yay! See you next week, kids, and have fun.